Hello, Bob. So I had to work early today, so I'm late in reading this book, but I'd like to get it done since there's about 75 pages left. We pick up here at the third paragraph. All the perverted passion may have been on Gurgaud's part. Though Vox and others have clearly doubted this, it is certainly hard to believe that even in the morbid atmosphere of that pathetic, tawdry little court at Longwood, a general could have conducted himself thus toward his former emperor and commander-in-chief without some sort of encouragement. Surely it is more than a little odd that a middle-aged man could formulate thoughts which could be expressed in terms such as those that were used by Napoleon in talking about Gurgaud, or indeed to Gurgaud. For example, one little attack of jealousy after the departure of Lacasis was smoothed over by Napoleon, who explained to Gurgaud, "You possess the rough virtues, whereas Lacasis has the disposition of a woman. You were jealous of him." These two, these guys are like fucking high schoolers. These two spoke of one another and conversed together in a manner which at least recognized the possibility of homosexual attachment between them. Gurgaud's behavior may have been influenced by the devastating boredom of St. Helena, of which he never ceased complaining. Napoleon, who had written of dying of boredom in Elba, must have suffered from even more powerful emotions in St. Helena. We should forbear to judge him when we remember the terrible pathos of his outburst to Gurgaud. Do you think that when I lie awake at night I haven't my bad moments? When I think of what I was and what I am now. Poor lonely Napoleon, as a bubble just came out of my nose. Surrounded by non-entities, separated from every member of his family, embittered by hatred of the governor, the representative of the English oligarchy, who, in his eyes, had betrayed the sacred laws of hospitality by treating him as a prisoner, sick, in pain, and doomed to die before very long. Is it any wonder that he looked for comfort and friendship wherever he could find it? He knew how self-interested most of his entourage really were. Lacasis, a late recruit, and a figure of fun to the others in the naval uniform to which his claim was slender, was a sycophantically devoted slave who left as soon as he had collected material for 8 volumes of memoirs. Damn. Useful, but rather heavy-going. Pardon this camera work, but there you go. De Montholon, who was also gestating the long, dull book, has even been suspected of killing Napoleon with arsenic. He longed to go home, especially after his wife and family had left. But by the end, he had somehow acquired the first place in Napoleon's confidence, previously occupied by Bertrand. Could Napoleon have suspected that Bertrand was sadly disillusioned and was keeping a cruelly outspoken diary? Just how cruel it was, the world was not to know until it was discovered in 1946 and painstakingly deciphered by Monsieur Paul Fleuriot de Langle. The sad truth is that they were all intolerably bored with St. Helena and with Napoleon, during whose lifetime they were condemned to stay there. But Gurgaud wanted no money. He wrestled with his conscience before he would even accept a small pension for his mother. He craved only the affection and esteem of his capricious idol. The possibility of a homosexual relationship attracted less attention, somewhat naturally perhaps in the 19th century, than the gossip which hinted that Napoleon's life had been as cheerfully heterosexual as the world believed it had always been. If Mr. Cronin inclines to this view, it is not on account of the gossip, from which he very properly remains as aloof as did Lord Rosebery. But from the diaries of Gurgaud and Verling, he deduces that Napoleon's behavior, attitudes, and conversation were, from a sexual point of view, just what one would expect from a normal, healthy soldier. Of course, Verlaine never spoke to Napoleon, and he said little in his diary about Gurgaud, except that Madame Bertrand had told him that her husband had not wanted Gergaud to come to St. Helena, and that Marshal Soult could not bear to see him in the emperor's antechamber, as he considered him to be a man of no stability of character. Deductions are a matter of opinion, but it is a matter of fact, with which any psychiatrist would agree, that the behavior, attitudes, and conversation of many homosexual men appear robustly heterosexual. They may affect large mustaches. What? They may affect large mustaches, big pipes, and hairy tweeds, make a show of shunning homosexual males and enjoying the society of women. It is all a matter of the psychological process of overcompensation. One might suspect that many members of teenage queer-bashing gangs are overreacting to unconfessed fears and doubts of their own orientation. I have already indicated why I am as little impressed by Napoleon's boasting of his successes with women as was his close friend Caulaincourt, who considered that one might imagine Napoleon only engaged in amorous pursuits for the sake of talking about them. That sort of talk is more likely to indicate weak sexuality than the reverse. Despite Napoleon's evident pleasure in the society of Madame Bertrand and Montholon, Madames Bertrand and Montholon, when he was not being abominably rude to them, I feel that it was the homosexual component of this bisexual individual's exceptionally complex personality which flourished in St. Helena, where he was more in the society of men than of women, as indeed he was throughout his life, although the English had refused to allow Napoleon to take to St. Helena. A handsome 16-year-old page, Saint Catherine de Audefriedi, young Lacasis, was not the only attractive youth in Longwood House. Napoleon was still surrounded by handsome young men in their 20s to be slapped and to have their ears pulled. Even Count Montholon was effeminate in appearance, according to Claude Manceron, who describes Gergaud as a child of 30, a handsome boy, and all too well aware of it, and possessing a little too much fat about the buttocks. British naval officers had noticed that Napoleon's manner was cold and formal to his staff. Admiral Coburn, probably, called it most overbearing, if not absolutely rude, in sharp contrast to his familiarity with his servants. These included the valets, young Saint Denis, known as Ali for reasons which are explained later, and Marchand, who Napoleon used to call Mademoiselle Marchand when he was in a good temper. So Ali tells us. Navarraz, a burly Swiss groom, may have earned his place by his courage during one of the early attempts on Napoleon's life. Is there water on this cover? No. It's kind of a little damp there. Of the Corsicans, one, Cipriani Franceschi, the major domo, was to die in St. Helena, while Santini, the keeper of the portfolio, lived to become one of the guardians of the emperor's last resting place in the Invalides. Gentilini, a footman from Elba, was exceptionally handsome and quite a ladies' man. Marchand said that Napoleon was especially fond of Ali and did not want him to marry, which, however, he managed to organize for himself without Napoleon's interference. Suspecting perhaps that a man is not always a hero to his valet, Napoleon asked Ali not to publish his journal, and Ali said he had destroyed it. He remembered enough to publish a book, not a very interesting one, but Napoleon need not have worried. He is the hero. Perhaps we can invoke some sort of St. Helena madness to explain Napoleon's curious attitude to Gergaud and the odd words he used about him. But Napoleon, at the height of his great powers, and at a time which he used to call the happiest time of his life, had said things about another man, a brother emperor, Tsar Alexander I of Russia. He wrote to Josephine from Erfurt, I am pleased with Alexander. He ought to be with me. If he were a woman, I think I should make him my sweetheart. Je crois que j'en ferais mon amoureuse. When the two emperors first met for their long, intimate conversation, alone on a raft anchored in midstream in the river Niemen, it seemed to be a meeting of twin souls. Struck by the beauty of the young Tsar, Napoleon cried, "It is Apollo!" Alexander was tall and handsome with golden curls and blue eyes, a little ripe, a little effeminate, comments Claude Manceron. He was not only endowed with good looks, but with great charm, and although he has been described as having a rather effeminate manner, he got on well with women, including the beautiful Queen of Prussia. But at Tilsit, the Queen, determined to use all her charm for the benefit of Prussia, never had a chance when the two infatuated emperors were together. As Maximilian Box puts it, the third coquette, Louise of Prussia, found herself between two suitors who had eyes only for each other. Well, I mean, in their defense, they were both two basically dictators, and when they met, they were probably just bros. This guy's taking it a little far here. The actor Talma loved to tell of the stagecraft by which Napoleon used to emphasize the familiarity between these two rulers of great nations. The two large armchairs for them, flanked by a row of lesser seats for the kings and the princes of the Confederation. Napoleon always played the host. Everyone dined with him, and to the other sovereigns he made rich presents of jewelry and expensive objects, no doubt plundered from conquered countries in the first place. Remember the queer-bashing gangs overreacting to unconfessed fears? Maybe this major general was bisexual. Napoleon's private secretary, we'll go with secretary, de Menneval and Constant de Valet, from their respective vantage points, watched the growth of a remarkable friendship and later wrote about it. As Constant put it, His Majesty and the young Tsar became mutually attached to each other at first sight. The two sovereigns seemed sincerely attached to each other, and on most intimate terms. De Menneval wrote of the charming familiarity and affectionate intimacy which quickly sprang up between them, and he believed that Napoleon truly loved the Emperor Alexander and was charmed by his wit, grace, and affability. However, with the wisdom of hindsight, he concluded that despite the most caressing demonstrations, Alexander was not sincere. This opinion was not shared by either of the emperors. When the brief honeymoon was over and they were once again enemies, Alexander was to say, "Oh, I loved that man," and Napoleon also claimed that the affection between them had been sincere, adding, "He pleased me, and I loved him." Lacasse, who reported that remark in St. Helena, wrote as follows about the second meeting between the two at Erfurt. In 1808, the two emperors gave one another the greatest marks of affection. They passed many hours together in the charm of a perfect intimacy and the most familiar relations of private life. "We were two young boon companions," said the emperor, whose mutual pleasures could have no secrets from one another. "Deux jeunes gens de bonne compagnie." Napoleon was 38, and Alexander 8 years younger. When the two emperors met at Erfurt, their affectionate embraces went so far beyond the perfunctory, ceremonial little hugs usually associated with such occasions that the onlookers were astounded by their warm and loving nature. During a play, when an actor declaimed, "The friendship of a great man is a blessing of the gods," Alexander rose suddenly and kissed Napoleon. When Napoleon and Alexander went for a ride with the King of Prussia, Napoleon found the king very much in the way, and at the end of the ride the two emperors dismounted in an instant and took each other by the hand to go upstairs together. Quite an Egyptian scene. The emperors were always glad to get rid of the king and to spend long hours until well beyond midnight in intimate conversation. It may have been for political reasons that Napoleon set himself to charm the strange, impressionable young Tsar, and he was never above that sort of thing when it suited his purpose, but he was always eager for true personal friendship with a genuine hereditary monarch, and was probably delighted to find that he could establish such a friendship on terms of a mutual tendency to romantic fantasy. He did, however, admit that he had never fully understood the Tsar's mind. There was a piece missing, was how he put it. It was perhaps the difference between Corsican and Russian fantasy. On the other hand, the astute Napoleon may have discerned the fact that Alexander was mentally unstable, a case of schizophrenia in all probability, with his marked emotional instability. The Tsar had little difficulty in persuading himself that his frequent changes of policy sprang from genuine conviction, though much soul searching was involved in the process. He was often in the grip of a profound Russian melancholy, which at times amounted to mental illness and finally progressed to depressive mania. Many believed that his death was faked in order to allow him to go and live a secret life as a hermit. The victim of a state marriage at the age of 15, in his relations with women, Alexander was always seeking for a soulmate. He found one eventually in the astonishing Lithuanian mystic, Madame de Krüdener, who specialized in strange prayer meetings and liked to try to establish some sort of mystic power over political figures. For the good of the world, as she saw it, European politics in 1814 to 1815 were complicated by the conflict in Alexander between designs on Poland, natural in a Russian ruler, and his vague religious mysticism, encouraged by this absurd woman, which led to his hopes of forming a sacred league or holy alliance of rulers who would unite Europe and ensure lasting peace. Much the sort of dream in which Napoleon sometimes indulged. It is by no means inconceivable that homosexual attraction played a part in the politically important friendship between Napoleon and Alexander. Albert Vandal, writing in 1893, clearly thought that it did. Napoleon, he wrote, saw that the handsome young Tsar had a tender, affectionate, and sensitive nature, responsive to friendship but giving and demanding a lot of it. Napoleon played upon this to make not so much an alliance as a deep, intimate, personal liaison, founded on attachment of man to man, in which Vandal saw something undefined but mysterious. Vandal believed that, too, that Alexander on his side was determined to woo. Is that like uwu? To woo Napoleon. Once you get a fucking editor, you put some periods after all these abbreviated words, and then you can take out to woo. Although he spoke French fluently, dans sa bouche, le français se modelait à la russe avec des inflexions glaciantes avec un don presque féminin. Almost feminine sweetness. I will not attempt a translation of the whole sentence, which calls to mind the seductiveness of the deliciously broken English of many a foreign actress. Alexander, like Napoleon, was certainly not averse to a bit of seduction if it suited his political ends. From Vandal, again, we learned that the Tsar exerted himself to charm and enslave Napoleon's ambassador, Caulaincourt. Caulaincourt himself amply confirmed this. At one of their earliest meetings, the Tsar deigned to embrace him, as he put it, and Vandal believed that Caulaincourt's delicate and sensitive spirit was bowled over by the Tsar's tender concern for him and for his happiness, no less than for that of Napoleon, to whom Caulaincourt was strongly attached. Alexander frequently questioned Caulaincourt about Napoleon's private life, suspecting that Napoleon had not really laid bare the most intimate secrets of his heart, as he himself had been ready to do. When the first overtures for a Russian bride for Napoleon were begun, they came as a complete surprise to Alexander. He told Caulaincourt that he thought that Napoleon needed real relaxation in love because he had too strong a head to be very sentimental. He said, "I pity him if he does not love anyone." He himself, he said, longed at times not to be a monarch, so as to be sure that one is loved for oneself. Napoleon, who knew something of Alexander's powers of seduction, once accused Caulaincourt of being pro-Russian because of his affection for Alexander. Caulaincourt refused to admit this and vowed that he had thought only of France's interests. His biographer and biography, Michaud, supports this claim to have kept his head diplomatically, as it were, adding that he was never captivated by the seductive, dangerous caresses of Alexander. Napoleon was a less impressionable and sensitive man than Caulaincourt seems to have been, but as a fellow emperor, he was in a position to return the Tsar's affection and his seductive, dangerous caresses, which he certainly did. As in the notorious Gourgaud affair, those two spoke of one another in a remarkable manner. Napoleon could speak of loving Alexander as his mistress. Alexander said the same about Wellington. Of all men, surely a rather odd pair of emperors. Following the trail blazed by Dr. Pretorius, the first psychologist to make a detailed study of Napoleon's homosexuality, has led me to examine 3 isolated friendships. I must now take a closer look at Napoleon's boyhood, starting where this chapter logically should have done, from what was said in Chapter 3 of his family background. Napoleon, writing about his time at a girls' school in Corsica, said, "Being a pretty boy and being the only one there, I was caressed by every one of my fair companions." He seems to have shown a preference for one of them because the others used to chant Napoleon di mezza calzata, Napoleon with stockings at half-mast, makes love to Giacominetta. To have been the only boy at a girls' school was not the best preparation for life at a military academy, and this must have intensified Napoleon's sullen isolation from his comrades. De Bourrienne said that he always withdrew to the library during play hours. On the only occasion when we hear of him joining in the games, it was to organize a snowball fight on strictly military lines. It had to be stopped when too much gravel was being added to the snowballs. We are not told who was responsible for this unethical conduct, but we may guess that the fierce little Corsican was not more sinned against than sinning. The loneliness and unhappiness of his school days, and the trouble and bullying to which his aggressively Corsican, anti-French spirit exposed him, have been stressed by many writers. But it is worth mentioning that the common assumption that his school days were unhappy is not based upon anything he said himself. Not one word of Napoleon's indicated that his experience at school were traumatic for him. He had an occasional beating, as most boys did until comparatively recently, but the trauma often fell upon other boys and the staff. He was a generous patron and benefactor to his former school friends and teachers, and would today have been a proud wearer of the old school tie, a loyal old Briennian, which in itself smacks of the juvenile. De Bourrienne, whose memoirs are suspect and unacceptable to many Bonapartists, was the most articulate of Napoleon's school friends, but he was not the first to write about those early days. Pride of place belongs to an Englishman, or possibly a Scotsman, who was the boy librarian at Brienne, and consequently saw a lot of young Bonaparte. His account of Napoleon at Brienne, published in 1797 in London, under the name Mr. C.H., was followed in 1802 by an anonymous pamphlet published in Leipzig, the author of which claimed to have been with Napoleon, both at Brienne and the Royal Military School in Paris. Both these accounts are written in admiring tones and tell the well-worn anecdotes which crop up in all subsequent books, though without the customary claims to have discerned in the boy signs of what the man was to become. The most valuable insight into the hero's character, which Mr. C.H. gives us, lies in his explanation of the boy's bizarre conduct in an incident described in many books. During a fireworks display in celebration of the birthday of Louis XVI, an explosion started a dangerous fire next to Napoleon's garden. When some cadets broke through the hedge to escape the flames, he attacked them ferociously with a pickaxe, driving them back into the fire. Mr. C.H. does not minimize the ferocity Indeed, he says that Napoleon increased the number of the wounded, but we learn what lay beneath it. Napoleon had forced his two partners in this garden to give it up entirely to him and had spent all of his money on it, fencing it off, and in 2 years had made it a retreat worthy of a hermit. His hedge was in fact concrete reinforcement of the abstract hedge which the rather lonely and morose little boy erected around himself. Perhaps he was not quite so lonely as usually supposed. Alexander Assier, in 1874, painted quite a pleasing picture of the small Brienne cadet, but struck the first note of slight hostility to de Bourrienne. The most recent detailed study of Napoleon's youth is that of Dr. Paul Bartel in La Jeunesse Inédite de Napoleon, who draws, among many sources, upon the 3 stodgy volumes of A. Chiquet, Frederic Masson's books, and the recently discovered Cahiers de Souvenirs of Alexander de Mazis, a close friend of Napoleon, at the military school in Paris. And later, in his first regiment, Dr. Bartel tells all the history of the military schools, their curricula, even their clothes lists. A jarring note to suffering parents today. Napoleon's principal school friends, according to Dr. Bartel, were Charles Lee Lear de Villiers-sur-Arche. What the fuck kind of name is that? At Brienne, Alexander de Mazis at the military school in Paris, both of whom were a year older than Napoleon, and Lagier de Bellicourt, a year younger, who was both at Brienne and Paris. Dr. Bartel has little to say about Fauvelet de Bourrienne, who was certainly the best known of his comrades at Brienne, according to Masson, and de Bourrienne himself had even less to say about these other friends. He mentions Roger de Bellicourt only in list of the cadets who went on with Napoleon to Paris, which was the point at which de Bourrienne's own close association with Napoleon was broken off for some 13 years until he became his private secretary. In 1797, Charles Lear, a relative of Marshal Marmont, sounds a kindly, extroverted kind of boy who claimed to have discerned the tenderness and sensitivity beneath Napoleon's forbidding exterior. The friendship persisted. Charles later hoped to gain from it some encouragement and recognition of his talents, which do not appear to have been great. He claimed to have befriended the young Napoleon, and when his sister rebuked him for tudiant, the first consul, he replied, "Ma, may nantios, blah, 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 blah." When they left Brienne, he commended his friend to the care of Alexander de Mazis, as he himself was going to another school in Metz. Napoleon rejected de Mazis until after a quarrel with an older boy called Champereau, appointed to be the younger cadet's instructor in musketry. Alexander was given the task. After this, their friendship became very close and was further cemented when they joined the same regiment. De Mazis, his name appears as Des Mazis or Damazis in some books, was always falling in love, and Napoleon would pompously recall him to a sense of duty and treat him to diatribes against love and women on the lines which I have already quoted. This led Alexander to express the opinion that Bonaparte's habitual way of life was a purity which was extremely rare in a young man, that he could not conceive of him ever being dominated by a woman. He always shunned everything of doubtful morality. In one curious incident which Alexander described, a young woman was brought to Napoleon dressed as a man. Napoleon refused to embrace her and saw through the ruse. Just what may have been the object of such transvestist tricks we can only guess. The sex life of young Bonaparte may have been an object of speculation among his comrades, or they were just playing a fucking joke on him, dude. When de Mazis was in the sick bay, Napoleon confined him to his room for 3 days, refusing to leave it, even to attend to the calls of nature. But according to the custom of the island, pouring his immondices out of the window. Napoleon and de Mazis left Paris to join their regiment on the same this time I'm not cutting out the cough, and continued to live less as friends than as brothers. Oscar Browning's statement that in Paris they shared a room is thought by Dr. Bartel to be inaccurate because of the care taken to prevent homosexual practices which were known to be prevalent in French military schools at that time. Everyone knew about the nymphs at Brienne, les Indecents, as they were called. At Tournon, it was on the tip of this iceberg that Napoleon's friendship with the third special friend was to be founded. Roger de Bellicourt soon became a nymph. He was a warm and companionable boy for whom Napoleon felt considerable affection, but when he realized how the land lay, he warned Roger against his evil associates. With success, he thought, but Roger did not want to reform and eventually got drawn into homosexual circles in Paris. I'm going to stop there because I'm reading both awfully and more awfully. Who knows if I can finish in 3 parts. We'll find out. That's all.